We are delighted to welcome Rabbi Douglas Krantz this evening to talk about a topic that we wish we didn't have to talk about, quite frankly. But the issue of anti-Semitism and the current rise in anti-Semitic acts is of concern to all of us. And so we're looking forward to Douglas sharing with us some history of this aspect of belief and behavior, and a perspective on the current environment and the ways in which our political and community interactions are feeding into the increase that we are seeing in what are really horrific acts. Before we start, many of you know Rabbi Krantz. He is the founding rabbi of Congregation B'nai Yisrael. Is that an appropriate?
Perfect.
Thank
Perfect.
you. In Armonk, New York. And I was reading Douglas's bio tonight. And if I were to relate it to you, that would be the end of our program this evening. He has an amazing eclectic background, including being an EMT and a firefighter and an, I don't know, I think you've done, did you play professional football, Douglas?
No, the fire department and the EMT was my midlife crisis.
Well, anyway, it worked. Quite an amazing background. And was, I believe, titled the Rabbi in Residence with the Episcopal Church of St. Andrew and Matthew here in Wilmington for a number of years. And that's actually where I first encountered Douglas. So I know that he and Greg have a relationship that goes way back. And we are just delighted that you're here this evening to give this program. Douglas's history is replete with actions in support of social justice and civil rights and peace. And so we are grateful for your spending the time with us this evening. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I have some opening remarks to share, and then really I want to share a few ideas and then move to a discussion. I want to begin by suggesting to you that I view anti-Semitism as akin to racism, that it comes in that category of dealing with human beings in stereotypical ways. And so I just wanted to put that thought out there. And I would tell you all that my wife's family and my family on both of our grandparents' sides all fled from Russian anti-Semitism. And that's how we grew up. We grew up on those stories about Cossacks, menacing our grandparents when they were younger. And so I share that because that's a common perspective for people my age, that is to say, in their 70s, Jews in their 70s. And so I just wanted you to know what I heard as a child. And what I heard as a child, I didn't understand. But as an adult, I understand that what I heard was trauma, people who had been emotionally traumatized. And so anti-Semitism is unfortunately not only old, but not gone either. I have some numbers about that are somewhat disturbing. I want to begin by reading you a poem. Some of you may have heard it, but I think it sets the tone very interestingly. It's the parable of the young man and the old by Wilfred Owen, who was a British poet. And it goes like this. So Abram rose and clave the wood and went and took the fire with him and the knife. And as they sojourned both of them together, Isaac, the firstborn, spoke and said, my father, behold the preparations, fire and iron. But where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Then Abram bound the youth with belts and straps and builded parapets, the trenches there, and stretched forth the knife to slay his son. when lo, an angel called him out of heaven, saying, lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do anything to him. Behold, a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Offer the ram of pride instead of him. But the old man would not so, but he slew his son and half the seed of Europe one by one. That's what happened. In a sense, if you want to know what the Holocaust was, it was a kind of a slaughter. I view anti-Semitism as said before, as a form of racism. The Holocaust was, in my mind, a culminating event in centuries of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, centuries and centuries. And the Holocaust happened because the technology had changed from the early Middle Ages. I mean, you could actually kill millions of people by the 1940s. That technology was available. And so the Holocaust was, for me, a kind of a wedding of anti-Semitism and technology. And I want to say that racism and bigotry of the sort of anti-Semitism is one part, is also still rather rampant in our own society. We have not overcome our prejudices, as I thought we would in many ways. I remember when I spoke at Westminster a number of years ago, I was really, in many ways, and was and still am in some ways, unnerved and traumatized by what happened in Virginia a few years ago, and when President Trump said there were good people on both sides, and there weren't. There were bad people and there were good people, and I say that because white supremacy and anti-Semitism are, in my mind, closely related. I want to share with you a memory that animates what I'm about to say, some of these remarks. And I've, as a grown-up, I never recovered from this childhood memory. Where I grew up in West Los Angeles, there was a bakery that my mother just loved. And it was called the Beverlywood Bakery. It's on Pico Boulevard. It's still there today. She used to take us there when we were little boys. And there were these very, very nice, wonderful women who would always give my brothers and me cookies. And when they extended their hand to give us the cookies, they had numbers written on them. And I didn't know what they were until I was much older. But I didn't associate those numbers with the destruction of the European Jewish community because I didn't know what they were. I was too young. I associated those numbers with cookies. And I remember when I moved to Jerusalem in 1970, after I graduated college, I remember seeing all of those numbers on the arms of then older women living in Israel, and realized, of course, that those women who gave me those cookies were suffering from very difficult memories, which I, as a 4-year-old, couldn't have imagined. And so some of this is somehow deep inside of me. I really have never experienced much anti-Semitism in my life, in part because of where I lived. And if you live in Southern California and in New York most of your life, you're not living in areas of the country where anti-Semitism is openly expressed. And I'm not saying it's not there, I'm just saying you just don't run into it. And but as a young man, when I was 16, my brother and I went with some friends to the Grand Canyon for the first time to hike there. And anyway, we went in the winter, and it was very cold, and whatever it was, we had a wonderful experience hiking the Grand Canyon, but we decided to head south for warm weather. And we decided we were going to go to cross into Mexico to see what Nogales looked like. And we went to a gas station before we crossed over. And we asked somebody who had just come back, and they had packages from Nogales, well, what's it like over there? And remember, I was 16 when I heard this. And the guy said to us, well, you can't Jew them down anymore. It's just awful. Now, I'd never heard that expression. And Jewish, I guess, it means barter with them. It clearly was anti-Semitic. And that was the first time I ever heard the word Jew used as a verb. I wish I could say it was the last time, but I haven't had too many of those. But I guess in some ways, it reminded me that that there's a world outside of where I grew up, and not everybody thinks respectfully toward Jews. And my father told us that that in the Navy, of course, when he was serving in World War II, there was anti-Semitism there as well. And but mostly none of this has affected me very much. I think that the truth is that people just don't know that I'm Jewish. I mean, unless they hear me called rabbi, and then I guess they have an inkling. But mostly I'm just a white guy, and I see anti-Semitism as a subset of general racism, as I said, and I think that's a challenge that we have to overcome. I think we all need to integrate our lives a little more successfully, because we tend to be divided in this culture, racially, religiously, ethnically, and economically. And I think we sort of need to overcome some of that. And I think that these programs and with all of you have helped me understand you better, and I hope I've helped you understand us better. I want to give you some statistics that are profoundly disturbing from the Anti-Defamation League. In 2021, the Anti-Defamation League tabulated 2,717 anti-Semitic incidents throughout the United States. It's a 34% increase from 2026. That's disturbing, and I think that to a certain extent, the rest of the statistics are similar. And it's just a huge increase. I attribute some of that to what went on in this country during the Trump presidency, where I think some of this was normalized, and I don't know what else to say about it, except that it's disturbing. Some more statistics. There's a 43% increase from 2020 in acts of harassment of Jews. Vandalism is up, assault is up, and incidents states by states and the District of Columbia are all up, combined for about 58% increase in incidents. And we just all have to keep talking. I don't know what else to say. I don't think that that most people are anti-Semitic, but I want to hear from what you think. Somebody's got to have some thoughts.
If you have a comment or a thought, either use the raise hand button on your screen, or if you're technologically challenged, this works too.
Great.
Stephanie.
I admit to being well, I can't find my mouse.
That's tough.
I have a comment, and actually I was in a discussion group today with a woman named Meredith Weiss. Do you know Meredith, Rabbi?
No.
Well, she's what I would call a religious educator in the community. And she was very concerned because of some people that she was met socially believed that the phrase Zionism meant that it was some sort of Jewish supremacy statement, that Jews thought that they were very supreme and that everybody else was not. And she challenged them on that and tried to explain to them, what the word really meant. But she was very disturbed by the fact that that thing is out there, and that people, in our culture, in our town, in our community, have that belief. And her question to us was, where is that coming from? Is it the internet? Is it social media? Is it that people are just not educated anymore? Or
Yeah,
where's the information coming from? And the news on the televisions is so polarized, you don't really learn anything there.
yeah. I think that there's an interesting story here with regard to anti-Semitism and Zionism. And Zionism, what happened is that in the Ukraine in particular, Jews were emancipated relatively early. They became well educated, but they had no path to citizenship. And Zionism was really born in the Ukraine in the 1880s and 1890s and at the turn of the century, because the Jews who had Enlightenment educations had no place to go. And so that's where Zionism was born. Maybe we should go to our ancient homeland and see if we can't somehow find our way there. And so that's I think that's how it all began. I know some people have some comments and questions. Roger?
The statistics that you mentioned, was there any breakdown regionally? Because I'm thinking about the large numbers in New York City, not only as being the largest city, I think, in our country in terms of population, but one with quite a percentage of very Orthodox and very outstandingly, obviously different dress and mode and schools and education. I mean, there's been stories on the news about how the education in some of these communities in New York is, well, should we say, very non-traditional if you look at a standard education in the United States. And any comment about whether some of that is part of the problem or part of the issue of being, they're so outspoken and so obviously different in dress and whatnot?
Yeah, I think that my answer is going to be unfortunate in one sense. I think that they're easily identifiable, and I think that makes them a bit more of a target. You can tell if somebody's wearing a black hat and has a beard and is wearing an early 1800s or something, 1800s kind of outfit, that they're going to be identified as Jews by the way they dress, and so they are probably much more likely to be the objects of some kind of an assault or some kind of an insult than I am. And so I think that's just the way it is. I don't think that that there's I don't know any statistics about there being particularly more vulnerable than the rest of us, but I suspect they're just more visible. They bring a whole host of difficulties for all of us who are enlightened and religious. I mean, any fundamentalistic religion, as Hasidism is, it's a fundamentalist form of Judaism, tends to be narrow and misogynistic. That's that's my comment about them. That's all.
Too true.
Dave,
Dave?
did you?
My turn.
Yeah.
Two questions, Doug. One is, this is such a long-standing phenomenon. What cause? Do you have any thoughts on the cause or causes of it? Does it mostly go back to the religious?
I think it goes back to I think it's been very hard for Christians to accept Jews because of the denial of Christ. I mean, that's just something that happened. And that doesn't help anybody. I mean, it's not a helpful thing to have that elemental a disagreement between people who are liberal religionists. And I think that I think that there's a difference between Christ killers, which was a common phrase used, and Christ deniers. And one of the things that's hard to parse for a lot of people is that you can, in effect, deny Christ, but admire Christianity and liberal Christian values, which I do. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here on this call with the church. I just wouldn't. And I wouldn't be on a call ever with a group of Hasidic rabbis. Although I had a remarkable comeuppance from a Hasidic rabbi in Geneva. I was somehow invited to a conference there, and I, of course, went. And there was a Hasidic Jew, and I went up to him and I introduced myself and I explained to him in Hebrew that I was a Reform rabbi from the United States. And his response to me was, "I love you." And my response to him was, "Thank you." And my response to myself was, "Douglas, you're a bigot."
Well, let me follow up on that, because if in fact anti-Semitism is largely or mostly driven by a religious difference, then you would think there would be a decline as a society becomes more secular. But I've never, I don't know.
Too.
Yeah,
that's what I thought.
But I don't know if there's any evidence that either that's happened or hasn't happened.
There are two things. I thought it would happen for that. I also thought that the hundreds of Christian grandparents who came to our synagogue in New York to celebrate their grandchildren's bar and bat mitzvah services would somehow affect anti-Semitism, and I was convinced that it would decline.
Yeah.
But I want to go back to something, and I think it's important. If you lived your life in New York as I did in the time frame I did live in there, you were very aware of the presence of Donald Trump, and you were aware from the beginning that he traded in certain amounts of racism and anti-Semitism, and because he has a Jewish daughter and a Jewish son-in-law, doesn't mean he's not anti-Semitic. It doesn't mean he doesn't love his children either. Life is much more complex than that. And so, I think that You know, I think that I don't think that he caused anything, but I never heard him really speak out against racism or anti-Semitism in any of its forms vigilantly. And I think when you're not vigilant in those areas that involve stereotypical hatred, then you're allowing it. I mean, this is a struggle that we have to engage in actively. You know, I think I don't know if I mentioned in this church, but I remember, I was thinking about it the other day because my friend Calvin
It's
Butts died a couple of weeks
7:30.
ago. Pardon me?
That was my computer talking to me. I apologize.
Okay. A couple of weeks ago, my friend Calvin Butts died in Harlem, and I was watching the funeral on Zoom, and I remember in 1992, when the white jury didn't convict the police officers for beating Rodney King, that I figured if that jury had been in our town, it would have come up with the same verdict, the same racist verdict. And that's when later that day, I found out I should call somebody named Calvin Butts at the Abyssinian Baptist Church. And I needed to begin to integrate my life. And I've been working on that ever since. I think that's true for Christians and Jews. And I will tell you that I'm blessed to have Greg and Camilla Jones in my life. And it's a relationship on which I'm deeply dependent, as is my wife Joan.
We are more blessed to have you and Joan in our lives.
Well, we could argue about that too. Just as we can argue about the divinity of Christ, we can argue about a lot of things, but it doesn't affect the love. I think that I think that we really don't live. This is an awkward way to formulate it, but we don't live abundantly integrated lives. I tend to live a life mostly with people of white privilege. And
you're not alone in that, of course, Douglas.
No, I know, but since moving to Delaware, I have been increasingly aware of my white privilege because Joan and I are so friendly with a wonderful African American family who have reminded me of the nature and the dimensions of my privilege very nicely and very sweetly and lovingly. So I need to put that in there. But anti-Semitism and racism are scourges that we live with, and I think that I just think we have to keep making more and more efforts to integrate our lives.
Marge wanted to speak.
Thank you. I just want to thank Sue and Westminster for putting on. I am not a member of Westminster, so thanks for including us outliers in your programs, because I find them very interesting. But I just wanted to say that I grew up in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. I was a Presbyterian all my life, and Cleveland Heights was predominantly Jewish. And everybody loved in Cleveland Heights, as far as I knew, everybody loved the Jewish people. They loved the Jewish traditions. We worked our school calendar around the Jewish holidays. My parents in particular were grateful because the Jewish community demanded excellent education, emphasis on the arts in education. And I was probably midlife before I knew there was anti-Semitism. And it was a rude
awakening for me to find, and I happened to be working in a predominantly Catholic setting up in Chester, Pennsylvania, when I realized the talk among my coworkers was not something I was familiar with. I knew the racial thing, the black and white thing, but the Jewish thing was not. But I have to say now I struggle with, and I know, I'm not sure who on this call other than Greg and Camilla. I'm also active in Palestinian rights, and it becomes very difficult to speak out against the state of Israel without being anti-Semitic. I mean, those two things kind of are bound together, and I think in my mind, they're two different things.
Yeah, I want to make a comment about that because it's not just anti-Semitic. When I started working for a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in 1973, in the summer of 1973, when I was in rabbinic school. And I can't tell you how many people, especially after I met Yasser Arafat, quit the temple because I was a traitor. They left in significant numbers. I was a congregational rabbi, and I was accused of hatred for Israel when I lived there. I mean, I can't begin to tell you how irrational all of these realities are. I mean, I don't know what else to say, And when somebody called me an Arab lover, I told them that they were true, that it was worse than, not only was I an Arab lover, but I loved people from all over the world, people of different religions, people of different races. All right, of course I'm an Arab lover. Why not? And I will also tell you that in my time in Israel, I loved eating. When I lived in Israel in 1970, 1971, I ate mostly on the Arab side of Jerusalem because the food was so much better. And I don't know what that makes me. So anyway, it's
Roger?
I wonder if it would be useful to compare and contrast what has happened to the gay community in the last 20 years, where I think the overall, while they have certainly had their struggles, overall the acceptance of the gay community and LGBT and et cetera has increased in the last 20 years in public opinion shifts that are miraculous when you look at the history of it. And yet we don't see that apparently in the anti-Semitism statistics, and it's hard to see much progress in the racial divide that we have. So what did the gays do right, or how did we perceive them rightly that allowed this public shift to occur?
I would like to make a comment about that. I have quite a number of gay and 2 transgender members of my family. I did not always know that they were gay. They were not always transgender, but these are my family members. And I discovered that they are gay. I did not discover that they're Black. I did not discover that they're Jewish. And so there is an emotional familial connection that can occur with straight and LGBTQ individuals that is typically not the case with Christian, Arab, Jewish, white, Black families, people. And I think that the speed with which the LGBTQ acceptance has proceeded is precisely because people know and are related to the others and know them and love them. And so it makes that transition to acceptance so much easier. Just my nickel.
I want to share with you a story that is among the most shameful I can imagine. When I applied to rabbinic school in 1970, I was required to see a psychiatrist in Beverly Hills, no less. And so I went to see the psychiatrist and we had a nice chat. And I then asked him a whole bunch of questions about, he told me I could leave and he was through. I said, well, I'd like you to tell me some things about Freud. I'd been reading Freud in those days. We had a very long conversation. The short end of this is that the only reason I had to see the psychiatrist was that the Hebrew Union College, my rabbinic school, had a secret covenant, and they wouldn't admit anybody that was gay in 1970. And the only ones who knew why we were going to see a psychiatrist were the gay guys, because they knew right away and they knew how to fake it. And they got in anyway. And so what I'm saying is, when you talk about anti-Semitism or racism or anything else, Jews too, institutionally. I mean, that's gone now, but it was a shameful period of bigotry at my seminary in the 1970s. So, you know,
Maura, you've not spoken yet. Why don't you go ahead?
Sue, thank you. I just wanted to underscore your comments about the impact of familial relationships. And just from reading and conversations with friends who are members of the LGBTQ community, I think that their effectiveness has come from grounding their efforts in the concept of love.
Mhm.
And even today, when you heard people in the news talk about the federal bill that was just passed, it's all about allowing people to love who they love. And I think that's the foundation of their success.
Thank you. Dave?
Yeah, I wanted to also agree with Sue with your comment that I think is right on, that the great success of the LGBTQ movement is that so many people have now, well, first of all, that so many people came out and had the courage to come out, and once that happened, that people were driven to accept members of their own family and friends, which I think underscores Douglas's point about the importance of integration. I had another question I want to ask Douglas, and it ties into the LGBTQ situation in a way. It seems to me in the last 10 years maybe or so, there has been an increase in prejudice and violence directed to almost every minority group, including LGBTQ. And in the case of LGBTQ, I think that notwithstanding the fact that the last 4 or 5 years, things have gotten worse, over the last 20 or 30 years, they've gotten much better. Is the same true with anti-Semitism?
it's exactly true. It's exactly that. And I think that, look, I think that we have not dealt with those issues effectively as a country. And I think that people are still prone to wanting to quote the book of Leviticus, that a man should not lie down with a man or whatever, a woman with a woman. And I think that we have a long way to go with racism and bigotry, and they're not unrelated.
But
Because
my question though is that in the span of 20 or 30 years, LGBTQ prejudice has gotten much better, even though in the last 4, 5, 6 years, it's gotten significantly worse. And is that also true? Is anti-Semitism better now than it was in 1940s, even though it's worse now than it was 10 years ago?
Yes, it's better now. That's correct. But in the African American community, there are problems with the LGBTQ community.
Yeah.
I mean,
I
you
know.
go to a Baptist church.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I was very close with a reverend in Harlem, and it was the one thing we couldn't talk about. The only thing we couldn't talk about.
Mhm.
And a part of that is the role of the book of Leviticus in the Baptist church.
Mhm. Thanks.
I think
Yep.
what we have seen recently intensified, it's always been there, is fear of the other.
Correct.
But what has intensified, in my view, in recent years has been demonizing the other. It is weaponizing that fear into hatred and discrimination and the exercise of power to disadvantage the other. And that crosses, it seems to me, just about every subgroup that there is.
With the internet and emails, we have been able to weaponize hatred at a level that was never, ever available to us as human beings. At least that's my sense of this, that it has amplified the good and the bad.
In the name of free speech,
Yes,
we're allowed to say whatever,
right.
however horrific it is. Somehow that can't yell fire in a theater has lost its relevance.
I want to use a different word that we've lost a lot of. I mean, we've gotten some of it back, but during the Trump years, we lost a lot of civility. Civility was diminished in our country.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that I don't think that we should underestimate the significance of civility and freedom, and that incivility is not an exercise of freedom. Shouting fire in a crowded theater is not an exercise of free speech, is a better way to put it. And using racist speech and all of and being uncivil it just affects us. You know, I don't know how else to say it.
Marge?
Well, I think Douglas was
Greg.
I think Douglas was hitting the right point here, that we were at a point where it was shameful to be anti-Semitic or racist, but then we got national leaders who said, oh no, it's okay to be that way. Go ahead and say it.
Yeah, say what you're not supposed to say. And you know, and I had never heard of the Proud Boys. I didn't, or the 0%ers. I never knew anything about those extreme right-wing organizations. And suddenly they were normalized from the White House.
Yeah.
And I guess I would say it didn't just become acceptable. At some levels, it became encouraged and celebrated.
Absolutely.
And celebrated.
Absolutely. And I go back to I want to underline this again and again. I mean, Donald Trump was a notorious racist and anti-Semite, and who hides behind a daughter and a son-in-law who don't talk to him anymore, apparently. And he brought that to the White House. I mean, we haven't had that kind of a president that I know of, maybe since before the Civil War, when we had slave owning presidents.
Well, to your point, I think there may have been some that held those views, but the ability to communicate them and the ability to make them a fundamental aspect of civic discourse wasn't there.
Yeah,
Because we simply didn't have the communication media that let it happen. And so there were probably always some of those views, but it didn't have the impact that it has today.
I'm stunned that I had never heard of the Proud Boys or any of those. I'd never heard about any of them.
I think.
Never read about them in the New York Times. I just didn't know any of that stuff. I was stunned.
Marge, you had your hand up for a little while. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just thinking that those of us on this call here who are white American Protestants have an extraordinary amount of privilege that we don't even recognize half the time. And we're a little bit aware of the guidance Black families have to give to their children. I'm wondering what the guidance is in Jewish families. What do you feel the children need to know?
What we've told our children, we told them mostly that they were a minority, and that's all, because they're white, as I am, and the levels of anti-Semitism when our children were growing up were much smaller than they are today. And our children are our children, but all three of our children married non-Jews, and only one of our three children belongs to a synagogue. And what we tell our children is they have to live their lives. They're all grown up. And so, how they manage their lives and who they are is, I'm very proud of each one of them and thrilled by their choices. But their choices aren't my choices. And they're valid, and I love them, and I respect them and admire them. And I don't know what the future of liberal religion is, actually. Greg, I don't know if this applies to you, but I'll tell you all an interesting story. My rabbinic seminary for the Reform movement is called the Hebrew Union College. When I applied to rabbinic school, my classmates were 70. This year, the number of students applying to and accepted at rabbinic schools around the country was 4. So I don't know what that tells you about the future of liberal Judaism. I don't know. When I started my career, I was pretty much sure I knew what was going on in the world. At this stage of my life, I'm pretty sure I have no idea what's going on in the world.
Dave?
I was going to share. I don't know whether to share something or, but my 3 children have one grandparent who's Jewish, and I remember the first time we went to the Holocaust Museum. We were going through the Holocaust Museum, and there was the part that always fascinates me the most is how the Nazis came to power. But there was an exhibit on what I think Douglas is right about is the racial classification, because the Nazis treated it as a racial classification. And if one of your grandparents was Jewish, then you were classified as Jewish. And I remember my kids were probably about 10, 11, maybe a little older. And when they focused on that and they realized that in Nazi Germany, they would have been classified as Jewish and maybe swept up in the Holocaust, their reaction to the whole thing changed. I mean, it was visible how their reaction changed, that now this sort of distant historical event that was something of an abstraction became a concrete reality. And now my grandchildren are being raised in the Jewish religion, if any, and it's probably more none than any than that. But I like to think that both ultimately racially and from a religious point of view will become so integrated at a family level that these prejudices will slowly die out. But that's a hope more than a prediction.
I actually think it's going to take a great deal of work.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the work devolves to most of us who are here this evening and the people like us. One of the things that I believe is absolutely essential is to speak up. Silence means assent. If we say nothing, the conclusion that is drawn is that we agree. And it can be hard, particularly given relationships and work situations and circumstances, but there are ways to practice what can be said when an indefensible statement is made. It can be as simple as, I don't agree with that. That's not my experience. I used to think that, but saying something.
Yeah.
It may feel really scary. It certainly feels uncomfortable, but you know, the people who are discriminated against on a daily, hourly, minute by minute basis are uncomfortable much of the time. And tough for us to be uncomfortable. We need to speak up, every single one of us in every single circumstance.
I want to complicate things just a little bit more because I think it's really true. And what I want to say is I have more in common religiously with Greg Jones than I do with Orthodox Jews. And so that it's what I'm talking about is Orthodox Judaism is illiberal religion. All right. Your church is liberal religion. And that's a huge difference in the divide. It's not Christian, Jewish, Muslim. And there are liberal Muslims and enlightened Muslims as well. And I think it's important not to divide us by Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, or any of the, but either we're liberal religionists or we're not. And I think that that's where the huge divide is in this country. And I'm not sure that the fundamentalists aren't doing a little better than we are. Just not sure.
Yeah, I feel exactly the way Douglas does. I feel much more affinity with people like Douglas and with some of my friends in the Muslim community than I do with the fundamentalists or evangelical Christians, for sure.
Correct.
Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Norm Moore was wanting to get in the conversation. Norm?
Thanks for your patience, Norm. Yeah, you're still muted.
Here I am.
There you are.
Are you finding in the Jewish community, Jewish people who are Native Americans are finding that if the situation is right in the next few years, that they are prepared to leave the United States?
I'm sorry, Nate, I'm not sure I quite understand the question. Try it again.
Okay, let's put it another way. I had dinner with a Jewish couple, my wife and I did. And one of them made a comment that if conditions were right, mainly if we went back to the Trump type era, they are prepared to leave the United States. And they are US citizens and were born here.
Yeah. Yeah, the problem is you have to go to Bibi Netanyahu's Israel, which is proto-fascism. So I'm not sure that the choice exists as it once did I'm not sure that Israel is the safe haven that we thought it was historically. I mean, we're also entering a terrible reality in Israel that is frightening to me, and not frightening, horrifying is a better word. And I mean, it's open season on Palestinians, and that is a betrayal of Zionism. I was talking to a friend of mine today, and we are deeply disturbed in the Jewish community with what's going on in Israel, and I have not one kind thing to say about what they're doing in Israel these days, not one. And I'm horrified. I'm horrified by the racism and everything else.
Well, I
Norm,
want to
did they have
thank,
a
oh, go ahead. Sorry, Greg, go ahead.
I was just curious if Norm's friends, the Jewish couple, had a country picked out other than Israel.
Yeah.
Yes, they are. It's in Central America.
Where?
Central America.
No, where do they want to go in Central America? I'm curious.
I think Costa Rica, I think.
Ah, that's really interesting. Thank you, Norm. I wouldn't have, that's interesting. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you, Douglas, for the program this evening and for all of you who were here and participating in the dialogue. I think there is no question that the division among people one to another and the power structures in place and the desire to focus on the world as being a zero-sum game. If you get something, I have to lose. If I get something, you have to lose. That we are all, in whatever our religious tradition, children of God. And we all have both the privilege and the obligation to treat one another as we would hope to be treated. And so I am grateful to all of you for being here and to being part of this community and to working in every way that we can to ensure that as much justice and as much peace becomes a part of our world as possible. So thank you.
Douglas, I wanted to also say we're really grateful to have you do this for us tonight. It was very enlightening. And to make a shameless plug, Douglas is going to be teaching a class on Micah at Westminster in January during the 10:10 hour. So you'll be able to get Douglas in person.
Looking forward to it.
And we're letting Judy Moore in as we end. So Norm, please give Judy our best. And we will look forward to hopefully to seeing all of you next week when Reverend Canon Lloyd Casson will be our featured speaker and sharing his experience growing up in Delaware and Wilmington as an African-American, as a child, as a youth, his time in the military, and he will join us for conversation. So we are looking forward to that opportunity and hope to see you again next week. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.